There was a moment late at night when the door closed behind him and the room went quiet again. No cameras, no signatures, no one asking his name. He stood there longer than he needed to, as if listening for something that never came. Then he turned away before anyone could thank him. What stayed with him wasn't the relief on their faces. It was the fear that someone might recognize him. If you care about the real stories behind the legends, the moments they never explain, subscribe to RetroWaves. He had learned over time how loud silence could be. Not the kind that comes after applause or after a performance ends. This was different. This was the silence of places people avoided. Back rooms, late-night shelters, quiet offices where debts were discussed in whispers. Places where no one expected generosity and where recognition felt almost inappropriate. He didn't arrive with an entourage. He never announced himself. Sometimes he didn't even stay long enough to be remembered. And when people asked who he was, he gave them a name that wasn't his. Not because he wanted mystery, because he wanted distance. There had been a moment years earlier when he realized something about kindness. The moment it's seen, it changes shape. It becomes a story. It becomes currency. It becomes something other people can take from you. And he couldn't bear that. So he learned how to disappear inside the act itself. The checks were signed with handwriting that didn't match his public life. The visits happened after midnight. The conversations were brief, almost uncomfortable. He avoided eye contact, not out of shame, but caution, as if being truly seen might undo the entire purpose. Those who crossed his path later struggled to describe him. They remembered warmth, they remembered gentleness, they remembered how carefully he listened, but they never remembered a face clearly. There were rumors, of course. There always are when money moves quietly. Some said it was a foundation, others assumed it was a trust. A few thought it was a group, pooling resources behind a single alias. No one suspected a man whose voice filled arenas, because the man they knew in public felt far away from the one who stood in those rooms. Fame had taught him how quickly intention could be twisted, how generosity could be reduced to strategy, how sincerity could be reframed as image control. He had watched it happen to others. He had watched it happen to himself. So he built walls, not to keep people out, but to protect the meaning of what he was doing. There were nights when he worked alongside volunteers who never knew why he seemed different, why he stayed late after everyone else left, why he asked questions that went beyond procedure. He wanted to know names, not for memory, but for acknowledgement. And yet, even then, he withheld his own. Because the truth was, this wasn't about charity in the way people like to talk about it. It wasn't about being good. It wasn't about redemption. It was about control. Control over a part of his life that fame had never allowed him to own. On stage, his image belonged to everyone. His voice was dissected, praised, argued over. His personal life was speculated on by people who had never met him. But here, in these quiet exchanges, he could choose who he was. And that choice mattered more than the money. There was one moment, recalled years later by someone who only knew him as anonymous, when a simple thank you almost ruined everything. The words were genuine, soft, grateful, and he froze. Not because he didn't want gratitude, but because gratitude created connection, and connection risked recognition. He left early that night, no explanation. What followed was never discussed publicly, but those close to the situation later suggested he became even more careful after that, more withdrawn, more deliberate in how little of himself he allowed to be present. It wasn't paranoia, it was fear. Fear that the world he escaped into at night would collapse under the weight of the world that followed him during the day. There were debts quietly erased without explanation, medical bills handled through intermediaries who were instructed never to share details, phone calls made on behalf of strangers he would never meet again, and always the same request: don't tell anyone. Not because he didn't care, because he cared too much. Some assumed he was trying to avoid taxes. Others speculated he was hiding something darker. A few believed it was all exaggerated. Stories grown larger in retelling. But those who were there never forgot the way he insisted on anonymity, even when it made things harder. Especially when it made things harder. There's something unsettling about generosity that refuses to be seen. It forces people to sit with the act itself, without explanation, without narrative, without a face to attach meaning to. And that unsettled him, too, because part of him understood that one day the truth would surface anyway, not through headlines, but through memory, through people comparing notes, through whispers that slowly aligned. He just didn't know when, or how much of it he would still be alive to control. There were moments, according to those who later spoke quietly about it, when he seemed almost relieved to leave these places behind him. Not because the work was done, but because the risk was over for another night. As if he had borrowed time, as if he was always returning something before it could be taken from him. And yet, he kept going back. Which is the part that never quite made sense to those trying to understand him afterward. Because if secrecy was the goal, there were easier ways. Larger gestures made through systems designed to hide donors completely. But he chose presence. He chose to be there. That choice carried weight. It suggested that whatever he was giving wasn't just financial, that something personal was being worked through quietly, without witnesses, and that something had started long before anyone knew the name Anonymous existed at all. Long before the world began to suspect there was more to the story than a faceless benefactor moving through the night. There was a reason he needed to do this unseen, but he never said it out loud. For a long time, the two versions of his life never touched. By day, the world knew him in fragments. A voice on the radio, a photograph frozen mid-smile, a name that carried expectation before it ever carried truth. He moved through interviews with practiced care, choosing words that revealed just enough to satisfy curiosity without inviting intrusion. By night, he belonged to no one. The alias allowed him to breathe differently, to speak without being interpreted, to listen without being watched for reaction. It gave him a kind of freedom fame had taken years earlier, quietly and completely. What most people didn't realize was how exhausting that separation became. Holding two identities requires constant vigilance, a memory misplaced, a habit noticed, a kindness misattributed. Any of it could unravel what he'd built. So, he learned to erase his own tracks. He paid in ways that couldn't be traced back. He avoided patterns. He declined opportunities that might have made the work easier, simply because they came with the wrong kind of visibility. There were moments when the restraint itself became painful. People assumed distance meant coldness, that his privacy was a shield against feeling, but those close to him would later say the opposite was true. He felt too much. There were nights when he returned home and sat awake long after the city quieted, replaying conversations he was never supposed to remember, faces he had promised himself not to carry with him. He rarely spoke about those encounters, even to friends. When he did, it was never framed as charity. He described them the way someone might describe a dream: fragments, impressions, unfinished thoughts. He avoided meaning because meaning led to questions, and questions led to exposure. As time passed, a strange pattern began to emerge among those who later compared experiences. The man known only as Anonymous seemed drawn to stories of interruption, lives paused by illness, debt, sudden loss. People caught between what they were and what they might never become. It wasn't intentional, at least not consciously, but it wasn't random either. There was something familiar in those spaces, something that mirrored parts of himself he kept carefully hidden from the public version of his life. Fame had taught him how quickly joy could be conditional, how success could arrive paired with scrutiny, how love could be offered freely and withdrawn just as quickly. He had watched people project onto him constantly: desire, judgment, ownership. And in those quiet rooms, none of that existed. No one wanted anything from him except help. Not admiration, not performance, not access, just help. And that simplicity mattered more to him than anyone realized at the time. The first crack in the wall came unintentionally, not through the press, not through gossip columns or leaked documents, through gratitude. Someone spoke his name aloud one night, not his real name, but the one he'd chosen for this life, and attached it to a story they told someone else. Not maliciously, not carelessly, humanly. That story traveled, softened by retelling, stripped of detail but heavy with emotion. It reached someone who recognized a pattern, a handwriting quirk, a phrase that felt oddly familiar. Still, no one said anything. There's a kind of unspoken respect that forms around private generosity, a collective understanding that naming it might destroy it. So, the silence held, but the pressure of it grew. At the same time, the public version of his life was becoming harder to manage. Fame was no longer something he could step in and out of. It followed him relentlessly, reshaped him in ways he didn't always recognize. Interviews became more cautious, appearances fewer, withdrawals explained away as rest or reinvention, but there was something else happening beneath the surface. He was growing tired, not of giving, of hiding. There were moments when he considered stopping altogether, pulling back from the nights, the aliases, the careful choreography of secrecy. But something always pulled him back. A letter he never replied to, a phone call he couldn't forget, a face that returned unexpectedly when he heard certain songs. It wasn't obligation, it was continuity. The quiet work anchored him to a version of himself that felt real in a way the spotlight never had. Eventually, a few people began to connect the dots privately. Not journalists, not fans, staff members, volunteers, administrators who had seen enough generosity to sense a singular source behind it. They didn't confront him. They didn't ask. They waited, and he noticed. The glances lingered longer. Conversations became more careful. The anonymity he had built so meticulously began to feel thinner, more fragile. That fear returned. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just persistent. A low hum beneath everything. If this became public, it would stop being what it was. He was certain of that. The world would want to explain it, to frame it, to use it, and he didn't trust the world to get it right. So he withdrew further, not from giving, but from proximity. More intermediaries, fewer visits, shorter stays. Those who had come to expect his presence felt the absence but never questioned it. That, too, was part of the unspoken agreement. No one demanded answers. Still, the stories didn't disappear. They waited. Years later, when his name began to surface quietly in conversations about unexplained generosity, people struggled with the idea. The man they thought they knew didn't match the one described. The pop icon, the tabloid subject, the voice associated with fame, access, distance. None of it aligned with the figure moving through shelters after midnight, avoiding eye contact, leaving before dawn. That contradiction made people uncomfortable. So many dismissed it. Others held on to it privately, unsure what to do with a truth that felt too intimate to share. And he never corrected anyone. Even when he sensed the walls thinning, even when he knew the separation couldn't last forever, there was still something he hadn't said. Something that explained why anonymity mattered so deeply to him, not as preference, but as necessity. But that explanation remained untouched, unspoken, protected. The truth did not arrive as a revelation. There was no single moment where everything became clear, no confession, no final explanation delivered neatly. The way stories are usually told after someone is gone, it surfaced slowly, through recollections that no longer needed protection, through people who realized, too late, that the silence they had honored was no longer required, through patterns that finally made sense once there was no risk of interruption. Only then did the name begin to attach itself to the work, George. For some, the realization felt disorienting, almost inappropriate, as if connecting his public identity to those private acts violated the very rule he had lived by. Others felt something closer to sorrow, because once his name was spoken, it became clear what the anonymity had been shielding. It wasn't humility, it was vulnerability. George Michael had spent much of his life being looked at without being seen. His image endlessly interpreted, reinterpreted, and repurposed by people who felt entitled to understand him. Fame gave him reach, but it took his privacy. And with it, the ability to offer anything without suspicion. He had learned early on that his intentions were never allowed to exist on their own. They were always filtered through expectation, through skepticism, through narrative. If he gave publicly, it was framed as image repair. If he spoke openly, it was dissected for motive. Silences were assigned meaning. So, when he gave quietly, when he erased himself from the act entirely, it was the only way the gesture could remain intact. But that wasn't the whole reason. Those who were closest to him would later say there was another layer, one he never articulated directly. George carried a deep awareness of luck, not gratitude in the abstract sense, but something heavier, something that bordered on discomfort. He knew how arbitrary success could be, how easily it could have gone differently, how many people just as talented, just as kind, never received the chance he did. That awareness never left him. It followed him into every room. And in those late-night visits, that awareness became personal, immediate, undeniable. He wasn't offering rescue. He was offering balance, a way to redistribute something he never felt entirely comfortable owning. And anonymity was essential to that. Because once the world knew it was George Michael doing these things, the meaning shifted. The focus moved away from the person receiving help and back toward him. That was what he feared most, not exposure, distortion. There were people who later admitted they wished he had let the truth be known sooner, that the world could have learned from his example. But that assumes he was trying to teach. He wasn't. He was trying to survive his own conscience, In the years before his death, his public life grew quieter, his appearances rarer, his distance more noticeable. Some interpreted that as retreat, others as decline. Few understood it as resolution, because by then he had already given away what mattered most to him, privately, deliberately, without leaving a record that could be edited or misunderstood. When the stories finally surfaced, they did so gently, not as headlines at first, but as shared memories. Gratitude offered without expectation of response. People spoke about him not as a savior, but as a presence. Someone who listened, someone who treated their crisis as ordinary, not because it didn't matter, but because they did. And in that framing, something became clear. He hadn't been hiding his generosity. He had been protecting its sincerity. There is a temptation, after learning this, to reframe him entirely, to replace the complicated figure the world knew with a simpler one, the secret philanthropist, the quiet hero. But that would miss the point. He was still human, still flawed, still burdened by the same fears and contradictions that shaped his music and his silence. The anonymity didn't erase those things, it gave him a place to put them, a place where he could act without performance, where intention didn't need translation, where kindness didn't become identity. In the end, that may have been the greatest relief of all, that somewhere, beyond the noise, beyond the expectations, beyond the endless watching, he was able to exist briefly as just another person doing what felt necessary. No audience, no explanation, just the act itself. And when people speak of anonymous now, they do so with care, not as a persona to be celebrated, but as a boundary to be respected. Because even in being known, the gesture asks to remain quiet. And perhaps that's the final understanding, that the truest parts of some lives are not meant to be consumed, only acknowledged, and then left gently where they belong.